Hello, I'm Scott J. Peterson, and this is Web and Data Application Development with Visual Studio 2017 in Azure. I'm here with Jeff Procyse of Wintellect. How are you, Jeff?
Doing great. How are you, Scott?
I'm doing great. We have got a whole bunch of great content to present here in this session, and it's almost overwhelming how much we're going to present here. We're breaking this up into 6 sessions. We're going to cover a whole bunch of stuff that's new with Visual Studio 2017. We're going to dig into a bunch of pieces of Azure, cognitive services, Office Graph. We're going to go all over the place.
It really is full stack development we're talking about, right? Building an end-to-end solution using all kinds of crazy Microsoft tools, platforms, APIs, and all of that. Should be a lot of fun.
I think so. And one of the unique things that we're going to do in this series, in fact, for the entire 6-session series, is we're going to be digging deep into a couple of these pieces, but we're really going to show the interoperability of a bunch of these things. So there's a lot of folks out there that may feel comfortable with cognitive services or feel comfortable with Azure mobile apps or feel comfortable with .NET Core, but they may not have had an opportunity to see how well these things can interoperate. And I think that's really what we're going to focus on. And we're really going to be building this huge solution at the end of this process that gives developers an opportunity to see how these things can fit together. So let's take a look at kind of how this is going to break down in these sessions. Because remember, we're going to be doing 6 of these. This is going to be session number 1, and we're going to focus in this session on .NET Core, ASP.NET Core as well, and then application insights. One of the areas that I think developers have had a hard time really understanding the power of application insights and how they can integrate into their solutions. And then in session 2, we're going to talk about Azure SQL, SQL Server 2016, and Azure Storage. And this is going to be the only time we touch Azure or Azure Storage in these sessions. But this is going to really break down what some of the differences might be in some of these storage mechanisms.
Yeah, one thing I really like about this, Scott, is there's a lot of good material out there to learn about the various parts of the Microsoft ecosystem. Great material in ASP.NET Core and all of that. It's somewhat rare to see something like this where a solution is built from start to finish that integrates a lot of these pieces. So that is the goal here, and I'm excited about it because, as you said, in terms of Azure, which should be on the mind of every developer these days, we're going to be doing a lot of cool stuff with Azure.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that was one of the ideas that I had when I came up with this series was to say, you know what, I personally am really good with this piece or this tool set or this service. Maybe I'm good with .NET Core, and maybe some of you out there feel like you're good with .NET Core or Azure Web Apps. But it's kind of tough to find some documentation that pulls all these together or a training path that pulls all of these together. And so when we first started this scoping out this series, I thought, well, let's maybe stick 6 or 7 or 8 of these in. And by the time I got done, as you guys will see in these sessions, we actually have, I think, 23 different tools, technologies, or feature sets in here. And we have real-world working examples of how to put these in place. So again, this is not the only time we're going to cover storage in session 2. We're going to keep bouncing back and forth to it. And one thing I think we're going to bring out in this series is understanding what some of the blessings and benefits are, advantages to some of these different pieces, these different types of storage. Yeah. For example, we're going to throw around some words like document DB or object storage. And a lot of folks out there, I know the folks that I work with, developers I work with, may not understand what these are,
Sure.
what the blessings and benefits are of those. And then in session 3, we're going to get into Azure Functions and Cognitive Services, 2 of my favorite pieces. In fact, I wish I could do about 10 hours on just these 2 pieces, but we're going to stick that to about an hour there. And one of the things that we're going to do that's cool is we're going to be building things against Azure SQL or SQL Server 2016, and then we're going to say, you know what, let's just switch it up and let's put this stuff out to an Azure function, right? Let's take all of this logic that we've stuck in an app, let's put it out to some Azure functions and call cognitive services that way. So that one should be a blast. And then we're going to make a bunch of the decision makers happy out there, or the developers out there who've got decision makers saying, you know what, this is all great, but I want to see the data, right? Show me some business intelligence. Show me how I can integrate this in some reporting, and we're going to be drawing on the power of Power BI. So a lot of developers out there may be familiar with Power BI or may have used a little bit. we're going to do some cool things here. One of the cool things that we're going to demonstrate in session 4 is how easy it is to get real live streaming data in your Power BI reports. This is something that I've noticed as I've gone around. There's a whole bunch of great documentation on Power BI and Power BI Embedded, but until I actually did it for a client, I didn't realize how simple it was to say, take this data and show it live in a Power BI report. We're also going to do some integration with Office Graph there in a little bit of a unique way. I think in a way that may surprise some developers with some of the new Office Graph APIs that have just been released.
Well, like you, I'm particularly fond of Microsoft Cognitive Services because, simply put, they allow us to build types of applications we would never have been able to build before. And of course, we'll provide a lot more detail on that. But Power BI is something that's interesting too because it's not only seeing a lot of use in the development community, but also in the research community, the data science community, because you may not be a software developer who is capable of or wants to take the time to build a real-time dashboard showing data streams and stuff like that. But even if you don't write a lot of code, you can use Power BI to create these kinds of very interactive, visually compelling reports. So, and we'll get a look at that in session 4.
We will, and on that note, so if you're a data scientist, for example, there's our services support now in Power BI if you want to go that direction. So there's all kinds of opportunities for data scientists or developers who are creating that type of data science application. And then we're going to jump into Azure Search and Luis, and I'm going to actually pronounce it correctly through all these sessions. So there's a couple things you're going to notice that I'm going to pronounce correctly for our folks out there. One of them is Azure. I'm going to refuse to say Azure.
Yeah.
And so if you're wondering how this is pronounced, just type into Cortana or Siri, how do I pronounce Azure, and she'll say Azure. Luis is the same way. This is the Microsoft's Language Understanding and Intelligence Services, or the acronym is Luis for that. This is one of the huge opportunities for developers that most developers don't even know that this exists out there. And this is really some of the underlying logic for what Cortana actually does. And so Siri and Google Play and some of these other ones, or Google Now, have some of these types of services. But the cool thing here is, as a developer, you can integrate a bunch of this stuff and make your apps really smart and do almost no work. And we're going to connect that with Azure Search. So we're going to do that in session 5. And then wrapping it all up in session 6, we're going to do something that I have never been able to do before until now in the Microsoft world. So we're going to talk about Docker and Azure Container Registry. So this would have been in the past to talk about a discussion about Azure Container Services. Notice that we're talking about Azure Container Registry, something brand spanking new that's been announced. And then look what we've got in there, Linux and SQL Server. This is going to be a fun session. So the goal of this will be to say, hey, we've created all this cool stuff. Let's now throw all this out to Linux. You think it might happen?
In a Docker container.
In a Docker container.
Running against SQL Server.
Yeah,
on Linux.
I don't think that's possible. Let's see if that's possible. We'll see at the end if that's possible. And so here's the way that solution is really going to break down. So in session 1, we're just going to be building an ASP.NET Core solution. And most of this content's been built for us, but we're going to dig through the code a little bit, and it should look very familiar to ASP.NET developers. Even if you're a web forms developer, you'll feel pretty comfortable in this. And we're going to talk about ways to add application insights. Again, an area that's been heavily misunderstood or underutilized by developers or decision makers. Because really what we want to do here is say, okay, ASP.NET Core has changed a little bit. There's some things we need to do differently with application insights. And I have noticed as I've gone around and talked to developers, they're actually not quite sure what they need to do to get it up and running. They see it front and center in the IDE. They see it in the Azure portal, but they're not quite able to connect all of those dots here. And we're going to do it. I'm going to show you how easy that is. And then in session 2, we're going to throw all that storage stuff we talked about, and we're going to sort of talk to the cognitive services. Not all the way. We're going to throw some of that stuff into a function. But session 2, if you're a data guy and want to get a good look at the SQL Server data tools in Visual Studio 2017, this is a session you want to see because we're going to do some pretty cool stuff. Some stuff that wasn't possible even last week was not possible.
Yeah, and obviously Most applications need to store data somewhere, right? There are a lot of different options for doing that, so it's going to be great to get a look at some of this.
And we're going to hit, so we're going to talk about SQL Server, and we're going to hit object storage a little bit here. We're going to come back to it another session. And I'm going to say right up front that a bunch of you viewers may be thinking, what in the heck is Azure Object Storage?
Yeah.
So let's just pretend that's Azure Blob Storage. So it's being called Azure Object Storage in most places now. The newest materials say Object Storage, and it's really a better name for it. In fact, a bunch of folks that I talk to really don't understand what blob storage means. Unless you're in the data world, you don't really understand what blob storage is. Object storage is a great name for that.
It is.
And so as we go throughout these sessions, if you see Azure Object Storage, you can just automatically translate that temporarily to blob storage. And that's what we'll be talking about, some cool things around that. And then in session 3, we're going to be connecting what we've created to Azure Document DB and Azure Functions. Another 2 fully functional, well thought out pieces of the Azure web and mobile and storage story that again are kind of misunderstood a little bit. And we're going to walk you through how we can connect or even migrate pieces of your entire solution to using Document D and Azure Functions. And then as I mentioned, for session 4, we're going to throw in Office Graph and Power BI. And if you're afraid of Office Graph, or if you've used Office Graph in the past and in your brain you're saying, this is just talking about organizations or corporations and learning about what your manager's doing or what's trending around them or documents, you got to watch this session because there's some cool new stuff with with Office Graph. That as a developer, even if you're doing consumer work out there, just consumer apps or any kind of development or your own prototypes, you're going to be amazed at some of the stuff we can do with Office Graph. And then as mentioned, we're going to throw in Azure Search and Luis, connect those in there. And the grand finale of all that, look at that. Boy, that's just amazing to see that on a slide that we're presenting that, but that's beautiful. So then we're going to throw all of this stuff up to Linux. And we're going to take this ASP.NET Core solution. It's going to be running in a Docker container. I have a Docker image created. I'm going to do almost no work. I mean, it's embarrassing how little work I'm actually going to have to do this for us to push this out there. And it's going to be running on an Ubuntu, server out there in the netherworld. And it's going to be connected to SQL Server on Linux. What do you think about that?
So it just shows me how much the world is changing, and changing in a good way, I should add. I just saw recently Microsoft is now apparently the world's largest contributor to GitHub. Open source is a big deal here now, as you're well aware. So I look at this and I think, why couldn't we have gotten there sooner? But you know what? We're there, and we've got some great stuff to show.
Yeah, we are there. And it's been a little bit of a transition even for me. I feel like I'm pretty dang open-minded, and this has been a tough transition for me, but now I'm just excited. There have been I've been developing software for about 30 years. There have been 4 or 5 times in my life where I've said, holy smoke, it's great to be a Microsoft developer, a developer with Microsoft tools and technologies. This is one of them. This is super exciting stuff that we're going to talk about here.
It is. I mean, the whole Microsoft ecosystem now, when you're a full stack developer, is so much more expansive than it used to be. There's so many more options. And it just makes it fun. It keeps software development fun, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think what we're going to show, this is just crazy to me. I'm going to bring this up, and maybe this will seem ridiculous, but this is crazy to me because we're going to be talking about ways that you could say, if you're a developer, you're going to be saying, I only want to create code in Notepad, or I want a full-featured IDE, or I want to have it be deployed to a Mac, or I want it to be deployed to Windows, or I just want to do it this way, or I want to do it that way, or I want it to be open source. This long list of diverse needs that we have as developers, much of this is driven by a client, right? We may not even want to do it, but the client says, I want this on Linux. The client says, you only have a Mac. You can just do it. This is just a phenomenal time to be able to use this kind of stuff. And it hasn't been available anywhere, not just by Microsoft, by anybody.
Yeah.
So the first session that we're going to get into is .NET Core and Application Insights. Why don't we just get right into this content here. So here's a quick recap, and I do this for the folks out there that may have a little bit of a misunderstanding or aren't quite sure what's the difference. We now have .NET Framework, we have .NET Core, we have all these versions of the framework. What in the heck is .NET Core? And I think by the time we're done with this session, you'll get a better understanding of what .NET Core is. I think that the key word is core. This is the core feature set that we can create solutions against that can run anywhere. And that's just the bottom line. .NET Core is cross-platform. And when we say cross-platform, we're talking about Mac, we're talking about Linux, we're talking about Windows, and there's actually some other scenarios. But in general, we're talking about those three scenarios. And we're talking about zero dependencies. This is something that we'll demonstrate this, but when you create a .NET Core application, there's nothing else with it. It's just the .NET Core foundation in place, and as developers, we say we want to add this to it, right? And then if it's compatible for that platform, it works. A couple of strange things here that are real fun, though, is that .NET Core is collaborative open source. So this is available. This gives developers the ability to go and dig into this code, see what's going on with it, and extend and adapt it themselves for their own scenarios. This is something that most of the world has been happy with other tools and technologies, different versions or flavors of Linux or different tools or technologies that are out there. But all of .NET Core is open source. You can go out there right now and you can see the code. The challenge with open source stuff is sometimes it gets unwieldy. I don't know if you've had that experience with other things, but open source tends to get unwieldy. So this is labeled, if you got to look at the way that this is labeled, it's facilitated by Microsoft, which means that, okay, this is wide open, it's wild, wild west if you want it to be, but I feel comfortable that at least there's kind of like some oversight that's happening by Microsoft.
You know, it's just my opinion. I think the most successful open source projects do have some oversight, someone to just kind of make sure that everyone's playing well together and all this sort of thing. But I tell you, as a developer, one of the things I love about the fact that this is open source, I may never want to go in and modify it myself or submit a request or something. I love being able to look at the source code, especially when things aren't working quite the way I expected them to and I need to figure out why. At the end of the day, when I can access the source code, there's nothing I can't figure out because everything's right there in front of me. And you know, parts of .NET Framework itself have been open sourced. I think it's read-only source, but I want to reiterate something you said. This is fully open source. Nothing is being hidden. If you want to go in and see how this thing works, there is nothing that you can't see.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really important point for a couple of reasons. Number one, exactly what you explained. So I can't be the only developer in the world that has been thrilled to death about the ability to, for example, to see the debug symbols of things that were outside my solution. So this has been very helpful because in the past you'd have to say what in the heck is going on. It might say out of memory, Stack Overflow, right? You didn't know what was happening there, but just the ability to go into the debug symbols was so helpful. So if you take that to the extreme, that's really what we've got with open source, where you can then determine what's going on. And if you're like me, sometimes you look at this code and you say, oh, I'm actually doing this in a crummy way, right? I'm doing this wrong. Maybe there's a better way to do that because I can see the intent from the code that's been thrown out there. So
yeah, I think that intent is important. You can go in and see what's been checked in, see the comments and all that sort of thing. It's fascinating to me to be able to see behind the scenes, if you will. So yeah, but you know, one of the questions that I've seen people asking in discussion forums about .NET Core is, hey, I'm a Microsoft Stack developer to begin with. I've been doing .NET development for a long time. Why do I need .NET Core? And there are a lot of answers to that question, Scott. The big one to me is I can run this anywhere that I want to now. Now, it doesn't mean that I can build any kind of app on .NET Core that I can build on the .NET framework. Some of the application models supported in .NET are supported on .NET Core, some are not. But some of the really important ones already are, like ASP.NET MVC.
And I think the challenge there, because I've asked myself the same question, the challenge there is that it's difficult to explain how beautiful .NET Core is, or ASP.NET Core, until you go out and you start to work with it for a little bit. It's almost a huge paradigm shift that you experience. I remember first walking through some stuff, and this was actually with VS Code, And I was walking through some stuff, and it just hit me how clean and simple everything was. So hopefully in these sessions, developers will be motivated. Hopefully you'll be motivated to go out and try it yourself. But the other aspect of this that I wanted to mention is that I can't be the only developer who's a little bit lazy at times on the open source topic. I like knowing that some really smart guys are going to go out and look at that code and enhance it, and I don't have to. That I know that other people that are outside of Microsoft may be able to go in and look at this code and improve the product, right? Improve the platform for me. And I don't have to do the work. I just know that there's smart people looking at it, if that makes sense. So everything Microsoft uses Core at the core. When I say that, I mean when we're talking about ASP.NET Core, all of the stuff that as we're moving into UWP, the next state of UWP, we're talking about Core at the core. And I want to reiterate that because this is a game changer for all of these tools and technologies. And so, developers who are thinking about that question, why is .NET Core, why do I care, why does it matter to me, is that it matters a lot today, but it's going to be impossible to avoid down the road. So getting used to it and getting familiar with it and understanding really the blessings and benefits, I think, is a big deal.
Now's a good time.
Yeah, now's a good time. So let's take that a step further and talk about what we're going to be doing in this session, which is ASP.NET Core. So if you're a Visual Studio developer, you'll be familiar at least with opening up and creating a template that could be an ASP.NET Core framework, and then in parentheses, framework solution, ASP.NET Core framework, core solution, ASP.NET Core core solution. And really, the difference here is how much or little of .NET Core it's relying on. Let me say that a better way. How much it's extending .NET Core based on those templates. So ASP.NET Core is built on .NET Core. So if we take a look at this breakdown here, we'll see that as we work our way up the stack, we can add pieces onto this if we want. Remember, .NET Core beyond that has no dependency. There's nothing needed. So if you say, there's this super important piece of functionality that's only available in the framework, and I don't need to port this to Linux or to Mac, we can go that direction. The cool thing is that most of the things that developers are using are available in .NET Core. In fact, I was very surprised at how little I couldn't just do in .NET Core. I didn't need to be using the full framework for that, which means so today maybe I don't want to have it on Mac, but tomorrow I do. Well, my solution will just port. It's really great. So the important thing here is that ASP.NET Core is built on .NET Core, but you can leverage the .NET framework if you need to later on. If that path needs to diverge, it can diverge.
And if you do that, you lose some of the cross-plat aspect of it, right? Mm-hmm. But to the extent that you can stick to ASP.NET Core and .NET Core, you retain that cross-platform capability 100%.
Yeah, and it's guaranteed.
Yeah.
This is an important part. So as you're bringing in, if you have third-party libraries or you have NuGet packages or you have scenarios where you need to add additional functionality, if you bring in a NuGet package and it's targeted for .NET Core, you know it's going to work. So when you push it out to Linux, you know it's going to work. And this is a big, big deal. You don't have to worry about in the old days where you said, well, it works on my machine, I put it out there and there's a dependency problem or something else like that. And so for developers who are nervous that maybe there's third-party, pieces of third-party functionality that maybe aren't supported, this is almost just a marketing slide here. The point of this slide was to say, you've got it on Windows, Linux, and Mac, and you've got support for all of this stuff out here. If you're an Angular guy, right, or if you just want to do all this in PowerShell, right, whatever scenario you have, there's going to be support for it, there's going to be extensions for it. And I've actually worked hard to find scenarios where I couldn't just do it in .NET Core, and I'm having a hard time finding it. Most of what I need to do, I can do with .NET Core.
Yeah, and it even supports, its APIs are a subset of the APIs in the .NET framework. And there are lists online that show you what's there and what's not. Code access security, for example, is not in .NET Core, but I don't know a lot of developers who actually use code access security, but reflection, for example, I was actually a little surprised to see that reflection is supported in .NET Core. It is, and that's very cool because It's not one of those things you are seeking to use all the time. Usually when you need it badly, and it's there, along with a lot of the other stuff that developers are familiar with from the .NET framework.
Yeah, and to be clear, some of those pieces aren't in place because they're just not ready yet. Other pieces are not in place because platforms don't support them.
Right.
So this is something that I ran into with the UWP scenario. I'd get folks that would ask me for certain pieces of functionality on a Mac device or an Apple phone, for example, and I'd say, I'd love to, but it's not available for that platform. The platform doesn't support that type of functionality. So if you see something that's not available in .NET Core, there's a chance it's because you can't do that on Linux, maybe, or you can't do that on a Mac, perhaps.
So what does ASP.NET Core code look like? What does it take to get up and running?
So
It's
here
like
we go.
hundreds of lines of code, right?
It is hundreds. It's so horrible to get it up and running. Obviously, that's a joke because if we look at this slide, this is it. This is it. An ASP.NET Core app is just a console app that creates a web server. And that, even saying creates a web server is kind of weird to people because we're not spinning up an instance of IIS. Right? We're not doing anything like that, and it's not even really a listener. Now, we're not going to go into details of a web server and everything else, but we don't even need all the code that we see here, but this is what we're looking at. So if you ever wrote a console app, for example, and it created a program.cs or VB, depending on your language of choice, and it created a main method, this will look familiar to you. This is it, and this is actually 2 lines of code in that main. You see that it's broken down for visibility, but I'm telling my web host builder what I want, and I can add more pieces here, and then I'm saying run.
So does this mean you're getting paid by lines of code? Since you broke it up into multiple lines
So
there?
this is actually a good question. So developers, if you're getting paid by the line of code, you may want to reconsider, because .NET Core is going to actually you're going to be able to do it in just a couple of lines of code.
But you don't have to tell anyone that.
You don't have to tell anyone.
You could put 600 lines of comments too,
Yeah,
documenting what it's doing. So
so do that. Make a lot of good comments. Get paid for the comments then. But this is a really good point, Jeff, because this is it. And developers very often don't believe this until they see this. So I'm actually going to show in a few minutes here how this is true. But this is it. It's just a console app that's spinning up a little bit of a web server. And so if you're in love with system.web.dll, I'm sorry. It's not going away, but it's going away in this world, right? You can still use it all day long if you want for web forms and stuff, but you don't need it anymore.
I'll have to tell you, as a longtime ASP.NET developer, I was involved in it even before version 1.0. I will not miss system.web.dll.
Yeah. And I still get confused. Do I need system.net, system.web? What do I need? I mean, because there has really been a divergence. That's the one beauty of this, is it's bringing it all back.
Yeah, and it's really taking a more minimalist approach. Over time, tools and platforms tend to get complicated, sometimes overcomplicated. A lot of people feel that's happened with .NET to some extent, and yes, it has. But I love this because when I see this, I think back to basics, and I think, don't saddle me with a bunch of stuff that I don't need. Just let me tell you what I need. And to me, this is what Core is all about.
Yes, exactly. And I'm excited that we get to demonstrate that a little bit.